I'm pregnant. Arya's hands pressed against her small belly as rain lashed the mansion windows. Victor stood behind his mahogany desk, a king in his empire of shadows, his gray eyes going flat at her words. "It's yours," she whispered into the silence that stretched between them like a blade. Thunder rolled across the city as Victor's jaw clenched. The storm outside seemed to echo the one building in his chest. His massive frame rose from behind a desk that had seen more blood than mercy, and for 3 heartbeats, something almost human flickered in his steel-gray eyes before hardening into ice. "You sold me out to the Kozlovs." His voice was quiet.
Deadly.
"The warehouse raid. My missing shipment. You." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "Victor, no, I would never. I love you." "Love." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You don't know what love is. Love is loyalty. Love is blood." He turned to Marco, his scarred lieutenant whose fingers nervously twisted the wedding ring he'd worn for 30 years, and Giuseppe, who stuttered when he was afraid, but wasn't stuttering now. "Take her to the woods." Thunder cracked as rough hands seized her arms. Arya's scream pierced the storm, but Victor had already turned away, his silhouette disappearing into shadow and rain. "Please," she sobbed as Marco and Giuseppe dragged her through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, dead men who'd built this empire on bones and betrayal. Her feet barely touched the marble floors, her designer dress tearing on ornate door frames. "5 years I stood by you," she gasped, rainwater mixing with tears as they emerged into the storm. "5 years I kept your secrets." Lightning illuminated Victor's face as he followed them outside, beautiful as an angel, cruel as the devil. "And one night you destroyed it all." The mansion's driveway had become a river of black water. Rain turned the world into a watercolor nightmare of bleeding lights and blurred edges. "Marco." "Giuseppe. Make it clean." The bodyguards exchanged glances. Marco, older and scarred by decades of Victor's wars, hesitated. His weathered face twisted with conflict as he looked at the woman who'd bandaged his wounds after turf wars, who'd cried when Victor came home bleeding. Giuseppe, young and hungry for approval, reached for his weapon. "Wait," Marco said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Boss, what if she's telling the truth?" Victor's eyes blazed with something beyond rage, betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. "The truth is she's a liability. The truth is weakness kills kings." He walked back toward the mansion, each footstep echoing like a gunshot on wet stone. "Handle it." Alone with the 2 killers, Arya felt her child kick, a tiny life fighting for survival before it had even drawn breath. The forest edge loomed ahead, ancient trees that had witnessed countless executions, their roots fed by the blood of Victor's enemies. "Please," she whispered to Marco, whose wedding ring caught moonlight as his hand shook. "You've known me for years. You've seen me patch Victor's wounds." Giuseppe raised his gun, impatience flickering across his young face. "She's seen too much.
She knows about the Sicilian accounts.
The judge we bought. The—"
"Shut up," Marco snapped.
"Just shut up." Lightning illuminated the killing ground where traitors came to die. But instead of following protocol, Marco's scarred face crumpled with something that might have been conscience. "Run," he whispered suddenly. "When I fire, you run and never look back." Giuseppe's eyes widened in confusion. "Marco, what are you?" The older man fired twice into the air, the gunshots swallowed by thunder. "She's dead, kid. That's what we tell the boss." Arya ran into the storm-lashed forest, her child's life pounding in her chest like a war drum as Victor's world disappeared behind her forever. Branches tore at her dress, rain blinded her, but she ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. Dawn broke gray and bloody over the highway truck stop where she finally collapsed. Her designer dress, torn and muddy, marked her as either a victim or a criminal. Neither identity would keep her safe in the fluorescent-lit purgatory where insomniacs and criminals conducted business over terrible coffee. In the truck stop bathroom mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman Victor had claimed to love was dead. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, a mother willing to kill to protect her unborn child. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to her belly, one hand cradling the small swell of life. "Daddy's not who I thought he was. But I promise you, he'll never hurt you. He'll never control you." She bought a burner phone with blood-stained cash from Victor's wallet, the wallet she'd stolen during their final kiss. The bus ticket said Portland. The fake ID said Sarah Mitchell. But in her heart, she was still Arya Valentino, the woman who'd loved a monster and lived to tell the tale. For 3 years, Victor sent men to every bus station, every shelter, every hospital from Seattle to Miami. He never found bodies. He never stopped looking. Private investigators traced phantom leads through 20 states while Victor's empire bled money and attention. His obsession became legend in the underworld, the Mafia King who'd lost his mind over a dead woman. But Arya had learned to disappear. She changed her name 17 times and learned to sleep with one eye open. In a Portland clinic, rain drumming against windows like the night she'd nearly died, she delivered twins, a son with Victor's piercing gray eyes and a daughter with her mother's delicate features but her father's stubborn jaw. 2 children. 2 secrets. 2 lives she'd die to protect. She kept Luca close, teaching him to be strong like his father, but kind like she'd once believed Victor could be. The daughter, Isabella, she placed with her sister in Oregon, a farm where the only guns were for hunting deer and the only violence was the mercy of quick death for wounded animals. 5 years passed like seasons in exile. Portland's rain fell gentler than the storm that had nearly killed her, but Arya still flinched at thunder. Her small apartment above the bakery smelled of flour and hope, scents that had replaced Victor's world of gunpowder and expensive cologne. Luca sat at their kitchen table, his dark hair falling over eyes that mirrored his father's dangerous intelligence. At 5, he already asked questions that cut too deep. "Why don't I have a daddy like Tommy? Some daddies aren't safe to be around," she'd whispered, pulling him close. "But that doesn't mean they don't love you." It was a lie wrapped in truth. Victor had never known Luca existed. Love required knowledge, and knowledge meant danger. The news played on their small TV as Arya prepared breakfast. Financial reports, weather, local crime, and then Victor's face filled the screen. Still devastatingly handsome. Still cold as winter death. Mafia kingpin Victor Russo's wife found dead in apparent car accident. Arya's coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on worn linoleum. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence as years of careful safety crumbled in an instant. "Mommy." Luca's voice seemed to come from miles away. "You look scared." She knelt beside him, studying the face that was Victor's in miniature, the same sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn jaw, the same eyes that could see through lies. "I'm not scared, baby. I'm just remembering something." An air. Arya's blood turned to ice as the implications crashed over her like the storm that had started everything. Victor's wife was dead. His empire was vulnerable. And somewhere in the criminal underworld, men were already making plans that could destroy everything she'd built to protect her son. I should have walked away then. But I couldn't. And before I tell you why that decision changed everything, subscribe to Mystic Tale by Luna and comment where you're watching from, because some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. That night, after Luca fell asleep clutching his stuffed dragon, Arya sat in darkness, staring at a phone number she'd memorized but never called. Marcus Chun, FBI. The agent who'd offered her witness protection 5 years ago, who'd believed her story when no one else would. Her hands shook as she dialed, each number a step closer to the abyss she'd spent 5 years avoiding.
Chun.
It's Arya Valentino. Silence stretched like a held breath across the connection. Jesus Christ. We thought you were dead. I need to see you tonight. Arya, if you're in danger. My son is in danger. Victor's son. Another silence, heavier than the first. Holy shit. Meet me at the diner on Burnside. 1 hour. As she hung up, Arya looked at the photo on her phone. Luca sleeping peacefully, unaware that his father's world was about to collide with theirs. Tomorrow, she would make a choice that would change 3 lives forever. She picked up the phone one more time, scrolling to another number she'd hoped never to use. "It's time," she whispered to the empty room, rain drumming against windows like the night everything had started. "Time for Victor to meet his son." "You look like hell, Arya." Marcus Chin sat across from her in the fluorescent-lit diner, his coffee growing cold as he studied her face. The years had carved lines around his eyes. The weight of fighting monsters had aged him like war. "You said you had Victor's kid." "Jesus."
Kids.
"Twins." Marcus's pen snapped in half between his fingers. The sound cracked through the late-night silence like a gunshot, drawing glances from the handful of insomniacs scattered across torn vinyl booths. "Where's the other one?" "Safe. Hidden. Victor doesn't know she exists." "And the boy looks exactly like his father." Arya touched the locket at her throat, Luca's picture on one side, empty space where Victor's photo used to live on the other. Down to the way he tilts his head when he's thinking. Marcus leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the scarred Formica table. 20 years of federal investigations had taught him to read between lines, to see the truth people tried to bury. What he saw in Arya's eyes made his blood run cold. "The funeral's tomorrow. Every family will be watching for weakness." "I know." Biggest mafia gathering in decades. Dons, underbosses, soldiers. All of them looking for signs that Victor's empire is cracking. "That's exactly why I have to be there." Marcus's coffee sat untouched as she told him everything. The 5 years of paranoia, the careful construction of new identities, the way Luca asked questions that cut too deep about fathers and families and why they lived like ghosts. "You could disappear," he said finally. "Real protection this time. New names, new lives. Witness protection that actually works." "Running didn't work, Marcus. Someone always finds you. The only way to protect Luca is to make Victor protect him." "By telling him he has a son?" "By showing him." The weight of her decision settled between them like a loaded gun. Marcus had seen enough mafia wars to know what happened to children caught in the crossfire. Blood was sacred to these families, but so was power. And power made men do terrible things to their own blood. "At the funeral," she continued, her voice steady as stone. "In front of every Don, every underboss, every soldier who thinks Victor Russo is untouchable. I'm going to walk into that church and introduce them to Victor's son." "That's suicide."
No.
"That's insurance." Marcus studied her face in the harsh diner light. The woman who'd fled into a storm 5 years ago had been broken, desperate, running on maternal instinct and hope. This woman was something else entirely, sharp-edged, calculating, dangerous in her own quiet way. "You've thought this through. Every angle. Victor's vulnerable right now. His wife is dead, his succession is uncertain, and rival families are circling like sharks. But if he has a legitimate heir, everything changes. The boy becomes untouchable. And by extension, so do I." Outside, Portland's rain painted the windows with liquid shadows. The diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink light across their faces as they planned a reckoning 5 years in making. "I'll need federal backup," Marcus said quietly. "Surveillance teams, tactical support."
No.
The word cut through his planning like a blade. "This has to be clean. No federal presence, no agents, no hint that I'm working with law enforcement." "Arya, you're walking into a cathedral full of killers with a 5-year-old child." "I'm walking into a cathedral full of witnesses. There's a difference." Marcus's laugh was bitter as old coffee. "You really think Victor won't kill you on sight? He might try, but not in front of his son. Not in God's house. Not with 500 potential allies watching to see if he's the kind of man who murders the mother of his child in a cathedral." The logic was sound, even if the stakes were insane. Marcus had spent 2 decades studying the psychology of organized crime, and he knew one truth above all others. Image was everything. Reputation was currency. And Victor Russo's reputation was built on being a king, not a child killer. What about afterwards? When the funeral's over and the witnesses go home? Then I negotiate from a position of strength. With what leverage? Arya smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, Marcus saw the steel that had attracted Victor Russo in the first place. With the only thing he's ever really wanted, a legacy. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they worked out the details. Flight times, hotel arrangements, backup plans for when everything inevitably went wrong. By dawn, they'd sketched the outline of a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. One last thing, Marcus said as they prepared to leave. The daughter. If this goes sideways, she stays hidden. No matter what happens to me, no matter what happens to Luca, Isabella remains a secret. Even from Victor? Especially from Victor. One child makes him vulnerable. 2 children make him desperate. And desperate men burn everything down. Marcus nodded, understanding the brutal mathematics of survival. In Arya's world, Victor's world, love was a weapon that could be turned against you. The less Victor knew, the safer everyone would be. I'll have agents watching from a distance, he said. Not close enough to blow your cover, but near enough to respond if things go completely to hell. They will go to hell, Marcus. That's what happens when you poke a sleeping dragon. Then why do it? Arya looked out at the rain, thinking of Luca asleep in their small apartment, clutching a stuffed dragon and dreaming innocent dreams. Because the dragon was never really sleeping. He was just waiting. The next morning, St. Bartholomew's Cathedral stood like a fortress of marble and grief in the heart of the city. Father Romano moved through the sacred space with practiced efficiency, preparing for a funeral that would be attended by more criminals than any service in the church's 100-year history. He'd baptized Victor Russo 30 years ago, had watched the altar boy with serious gray eyes transform into something that made hardened sinners cross themselves. Now Victor's wife lay in her flower-draped casket, and the priest who'd known him as a child prepared to bury the dead while praying for the living. Black cars arrived in procession, Bentleys and Maseratis, Cadillacs with bulletproof glass and engines that purred like predators. Men in suits worth more than most people's houses emerged into the gray morning, their movements choreographed by decades of ceremony and violence. Don Salvatore Castillo, patriarch of the oldest family in the city, walked with a cane carved from the jawbone of his first kill. Councilwoman Maria Delacroix arrived in city-issued transportation, her political power balanced delicately against her criminal connections. Giuseppe Torino, Victor's young lieutenant, stood near the cathedral steps, his nervous energy betraying the stutter he developed after watching too many executions. But it was Marco De Luca who drew the most attention as he escorted mourners to their seats. The scarred soldier moved with careful precision, his wedding ring catching cathedral light as he directed traffic with subtle hand signals. 30 years of loyal service had earned him Victor's trust, but the weight of his secret, the woman he'd helped escape, the child he'd saved, pressed against his chest like a tumor. Inside the cathedral, 500 of the most dangerous people in America found their seats among carved saints and stained glass. The irony wasn't lost on Father Romano as he watched killers and thieves bow their heads in his sacred space. These were men and women who'd perverted every commandment, who'd turned faith into fear and love into leverage. But they were also human. And humans, no matter how fallen, understood the weight of mortality when faced with death's pageantry. Victor sat in the front pew, his grief genuine despite the political calculations swirling around his wife's casket. Elena had been a good woman trapped in a bad world, and her death left a vacuum that rival families were already moving to fill. Without an heir, without a clear succession, his empire was vulnerable in ways that kept him awake at night. The service began with Latin prayers and ended with whispered conspiracies. Every family representative measured Victor's composure, looking for cracks in his legendary control. They saw a man diminished by loss, distracted by grief, exactly the weakness they'd been waiting for. If you're watching this thinking, I would have done the same thing, subscribe to Mystic Tale by Luna. Because the choice she's about to make will change 3 lives forever. 20 miles away, in a hotel room overlooking the city's gray skyline, Arya helped Luca into a small black suit. The most expensive clothes he'd ever worn had been bought with the last of Victor's money she'd been hoarding for emergencies. This qualified as the ultimate emergency. Why are we dressed up, Mommy? Because today is special, baby. Good special or scary special? Arya knelt to his level, smoothing his dark hair that fell across his forehead exactly like his father's. In the gray morning light, the resemblance was even more striking, the same stubborn jaw, the same way of holding his head when he was thinking serious thoughts. Both kinds of special. Are we going to see my daddy today? The question she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Arya had rehearsed a dozen different answers, but faced with Luca's clear gray eyes, Victor's eyes, all her careful words crumbled. Yes, baby. Today you're going to meet your father. Is he nice? He's powerful. That's different than nice. Will he like me? The innocence of it broke her heart. Here was a 5-year-old child, preparing to walk into a den of wolves, worried that his father might not approve of him. The irony was devastating. Victor Russo, who'd built an empire on fear and respect, was about to meet the only person in the world who just wanted his love. He'll love you, she whispered, the words a prayer more than a promise. How could he not? They took a taxi to the cathedral, Luca pressing his face against the window as the city scrolled past. He'd never seen buildings this tall, cars this expensive, people who moved with the careful precision of predators in expensive suits. Is this where Daddy lives? This is his world. The taxi stopped 2 blocks from the cathedral, close enough to walk but far enough to avoid the security perimeter. Arya paid the driver with cash, her hands steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Ready, baby? Ready, Mommy. Together, they walked toward the cathedral doors, toward the man who'd tried to destroy them both, carrying the secret that would either save them or damn them all. Behind them, Portland's rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder, as if the sky itself was weeping for what was about to unfold. The cathedral doors loomed ahead, massive and dark as the gates of judgment. Beyond them waited Victor's world, 500 criminals who'd kill without hesitation, who understood only strength and feared only weakness. Arya squeezed Luca's small hand as they approached the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. In 60 seconds, she would walk into that sacred space and detonate a bomb made of flesh and blood and 5 years of carefully buried truth. Madonna Mia, she rises from the dead. Don Salvatore Castillo's whisper carried across the cathedral's sudden silence as the massive doors groaned open. 500 pairs of eyes turned toward the sound. Mafia royalty caught between prayer and predation, their whispered conversations dying in the sacred space. Arya stepped into the nave, her black dress elegant as a blade, Luca's small hand warm and steady in hers. Afternoon light through stained glass painted them in colors of blood and gold, transforming mother and child into something between salvation and damnation. The effect was immediate and electric. That's Arya Valentino, hissed Councilwoman Maria Delacroix, her political instincts warring with criminal curiosity. But Victor said many things, muttered an elderly underboss, his weathered fingers reaching instinctively for weapons that couldn't be drawn in God's house. Father Romano, who'd baptized Victor as a child and watched him transform from altar boy to monster, forgot his Latin entirely. The priest's hands trembled against his prayer book as 30 years of carefully buried knowledge surfaced like bodies in a lake. At the altar, beside his wife's flower-draped casket, Victor Russo went statue still. Whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Old women crossed themselves with genuine fear. Young soldiers shifted in their seats, hands twitching toward concealed weapons. The very air crackled with recognition, shock, and the promise of violence that always followed Victor's past into his present. But it was the child who drew every stare, who made hardened killers lean forward in their pews and squint through the cathedral's filtered light. Even at 5 years old, Luca's resemblance to Victor was undeniable. The same cold dark hair, the same sharp intelligence in eyes too old for his small face, the same unconscious way of holding his head that spoke of inherited authority. Impossible, breathed Giuseppe Torino, Victor's young lieutenant, his nervous stutter absent for once as shock overrode his usual anxiety. Marco De Luca felt the blood drain from his scarred face as 5 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled in an instant. His wedding ring, 30 years of faithful marriage to a woman who'd never asked about his work, caught cathedral light as his hand shook against the pew's carved wood. The cathedral's silence stretched like a held breath. Outside, rain drummed against ancient stone with increasing intensity. Inside, the air thick with incense and conspiracy, everyone waited to see what Victor Russo would do when confronted with his own resurrection. Arya began the long walk down the center aisle, each step echoing like a gunshot in the hushed space. Luca walked beside her, completely unafraid of the predators watching his every move. His small black shoes clicked against marble that had been consecrated with prayers and desecrated with blood money for over a century. She stopped 10 feet from Victor, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw, far enough to run if his shock turned to the rage she remembered from that storm-lashed night 5 years ago. "Hello, Victor." Her voice carried in the sacred space, clear and steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. No tremor betrayed the adrenaline flooding her system, the maternal instinct screaming at her to grab her child and flee before these wolves remembered they were predators. Victor's lieutenants shifted like sharks scenting blood. Giuseppe's hand moved unconsciously toward his jacket. Marco's scarred face went ashen as he realized the woman he'd saved, the child he'd protected, was about to destroy everything. But Victor himself seemed frozen in time, his legendary composure cracking like ice under pressure. "You're dead." His voice barely above a whisper, each word carrying the weight of 5 years of guilt and rage. "You've been dead for 5 years. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." The old movie reference broke whatever spell had held the congregation frozen. Nervous laughter bubbled up from the pews, quickly stifled by the gravity of what everyone was witnessing. This wasn't just a funeral anymore. It was a reckoning. Victor's gaze dropped to Luca, and the world shifted on its axis. Every person in that cathedral could see it happening in real time. The moment a Mafia King realized he was looking at his own reflection in miniature, his legacy made flesh and blood and impossible hope. "No," he breathed, the single word carrying more emotion than anyone had heard from Victor Russo in decades. "Yes." "How old?" 5 years, 2 months. The math was simple and devastating. Conception could be traced to Victor's birthday, the night she'd given herself to him completely, the night she'd whispered that she loved him while he moved inside her like salvation itself. The night that had created this perfect little person who now stood in God's house, studying his father with curious gray eyes. Thunder rolled overhead, as if even God was holding his breath. Rain lashed the stained glass windows, turning saints into bleeding shadows that danced across the floor like prophecies of violence. "What's his name?" Victor's voice cracked like a teenager's, all his carefully constructed authority crumbling in the face of paternal recognition. "Luca. After my grandfather." It wasn't a question. Victor understood immediately why she'd chosen that name, the only man he'd ever truly loved, the grandfather who'd raised him after his parents died in a car bomb meant for Victor's father. The man who'd taught him that family was everything, that blood was sacred, that a true king protected what was his. Luca looked up at Arya with growing confusion and awareness that something momentous was happening. He was smart, too smart for his own good, and he could read the tension thrumming through the cathedral like electricity before a storm. "Mommy," he whispered, tugging at her hand with small fingers that would someday hold the power of life and death. "Is that him? Is that my daddy?" The question hit Victor like a physical blow, stealing his breath and shattering the last of his composure. For a moment, he wasn't a Mafia King who ruled through fear and respect. He was just a man realizing he'd tried to murder his own child, that he'd sent the woman he loved into a storm to die while she carried his son. "Oh God," he whispered, taking a step forward, his massive frame trembling with something between rage and revelation. "Oh Jesus. What did I do?" The confession rippled through the cathedral like wildfire. A dozen phones appeared, recording the moment for posterity and blackmail. By nightfall, Every crime family in the country would know that Victor Russo had a son, a legitimate heir born in love, not politics. "You ordered Marco to kill us both," Arya said, her voice steady as stone despite the chaos building around them. "You looked at me, pregnant with your child, and decided we were expendable." Marco flinched like he'd been struck, his wedding ring catching light as his scarred hands clenched into fists. Giuseppe went pale, suddenly understanding why his mentor had lied about the execution, why he'd covered up the greatest failure of his criminal career. "My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone." Have you ever felt that moment when everything you believed just shatters? Tell me in the comments, because right now, I need to know I'm not the only one who's been this afraid. But here we are, Arya continued, her grip on Luca's hand tightening as she watched Victor's world collapse in real time.
Alive.
"And your son wants to know why his father never came to find him." The cathedral erupted in whispers as the full implications hit the assembled families. This wasn't just about Victor's personal drama. This was about succession, about legitimate heirs, about the future of the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast. Don Castillo leaned forward in his pew, his cane carved from human bone tapping against marble as he studied the child with calculating eyes. Councilwoman Delacroix fumbled for her phone, already planning how to spin this revelation in the political arena. Underbosses and soldiers exchanged meaningful glances, each one recalculating their loyalty based on this new information. Victor's empire had just gained an heir. Everything had changed. "I thought." Victor started, then stopped, his legendary eloquence failing him in front of 500 witnesses. "The Kozlov raid. The missing money.
Everything pointed to you."
"You never asked me. I couldn't risk." "You couldn't risk loving me more than you feared losing power." The accusation hung in the air like incense, bitter and inescapable. Father Romano crossed himself at the altar, recognizing the confession playing out before him, not just of crime, but of the deeper sin of choosing fear over faith, power over love. Luca stepped forward, his small hand slipping from Arya's protective grip. At 5 years old, he possessed an unconscious courage that could only have come from Victor's bloodline, the same fearlessness that had built empires and toppled governments. "Are you really my daddy?" he asked, his clear voice carrying in the hushed cathedral, cutting through decades of violence and betrayal with simple honesty. Victor dropped to one knee, bringing himself to Luca's eye level. This close, the resemblance was even more devastating, not just in features, but in the way they both held themselves, the same unconscious authority that spoke of inherited power. "Yes," Victor whispered, his voice breaking on the single word. "I think I am." "Mommy said you were scared. Are you still scared?" The question, innocent and devastating, broke something fundamental in Victor's chest. Here was his son, his blood, his legacy, asking if he was brave enough to be a father. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most dangerous man in the city was being challenged by someone who barely reached his knee. "Terrified," Victor admitted, reaching out to touch Luca's face with shaking fingers. "But not of you. Never of you." The gesture, gentle as a prayer, sent shockwaves through the congregation. They'd seen Victor kill without hesitation, destroy lives without remorse. But this tenderness was something new, something that made him human in ways that terrified his enemies and inspired his allies. "I want to know you," Victor continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in this new reality. "I want to make up for every day I wasn't there. Every birthday, every scraped knee, every nightmare where you needed a father and I was gone." "We have a small apartment," Luca said seriously, his 5-year-old brain offering solutions with devastating simplicity. "And Mommy makes really good pancakes. You could come for breakfast." The offer, innocent and profound, made several hardened criminals wipe their eyes. Here was a child inviting the most feared man in the city for pancakes, as if violence and tenderness could coexist in the same heart. But before Victor could answer, before he could accept this gift of forgiveness from a son he'd almost murdered, the cathedral doors slammed open with enough force to crack ancient hinges. This time, It wasn't grief that entered the sacred space. It was war. Dmitry Kozlov strode through the entrance with 20 soldiers at his back, automatic weapons gleaming in the stained glass light. The rival family had been waiting for exactly this moment, when Victor was vulnerable, distracted, destroyed by the revelation of his son. Well, Dmitry called, his Russian accent thick with malice as he surveyed the scene before him. Look what the storm washed up. A dead woman and a bastard child. How touching. He raised his gun toward Luka's small head, his finger already tightening on the trigger. Time to finish what we started 5 years ago. You son of a bitch. Victor's roar split the cathedral air as time crystallized like fractured glass. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon with lethal precision, but Marco De Luca was already in motion, 30 years of loyal service and 5 years of guilt propelling him forward like a missile aimed at redemption. The old soldier threw himself between Dmitry's gun and Luka's small body, taking the bullet meant for Victor's son. Blood bloomed across his white shirt like a deadly flower, his wedding ring catching cathedral light one final time as he collapsed onto consecrated marble. Marco. Giuseppe's stutter erupted as his mentor fell, the young lieutenant's nervous energy finally finding focus in rage. The cathedral became a war zone in seconds. Sacred space meant nothing to men who'd already sold their souls to violence. Gunfire echoed off ancient stone as mafia families chose sides in real time, their whispered alliances suddenly tested by flying bullets and spilled blood. Arya wrapped herself around Luka, her body his only shield as automatic weapons chattered overhead. Colored glass shattered above them, raining down like deadly confetti that painted their terror in blues and golds. The saints in the windows bled light across marble floors slick with human blood. Stay down, baby, she whispered into Luka's ear, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Mommy's got you. But Luka wasn't crying. His gray eyes, Victor's eyes, watched the violence with an understanding too old for his young face. He was his father's son in ways that both thrilled and terrified her, absorbing lessons about power and loyalty that no child should learn in a cathedral. Victor moved through the chaos like death incarnate, his weapon barking fire as he carved a path toward his family. 5 years of rage and regret fueled every shot, every step. Don Castillo's men flanked him on the left, their ancient loyalty to Victor's bloodline overriding their fear of Kozlov bullets. You want to kill my son? Victor bellowed at Dmitry, whose soldiers were falling like wheat before the scythe. You'll have to go through me first. Councilwoman Delacroix scrambled for cover behind an overturned pew, her political calculations momentarily abandoned in favor of survival. Giuseppe fired with methodical precision, his stutter replaced by the steady rhythm of vengeance for his fallen mentor. Gladly, Dmitry snarled, swinging his weapon toward Victor with practiced ease. Should have finished this 5 years ago when we killed your whore. You didn't kill her, you piece of shit. Victor's voice carried over the gunfire, each word punctuated by muzzle flashes. And you sure as hell won't touch my boy. Father Romano crawled behind his altar, clutching his prayer book as bullets shattered candles and crucifixes around him. The priest who'd baptized Victor 30 years ago now watched his sacred space transform into a battleground, wondering if God could forgive what was happening in his house. The two men faced each other across bodies and blood, their weapons trained on each other's hearts. Around them, the war raged between families that had hated each other for generations, but this moment had crystallized into something personal. Two alpha predators fighting for the right to define the future. Smoke drifted through shattered light as the gunfire gradually ceased. Dmitry's surviving soldiers looked uncertain, their numerical advantage eroded by Victor's superior positioning and the fierce loyalty his acknowledgement of Luka had inspired in his own men. What the hell are you doing? Giuseppe shouted from behind his cover, blood from a grazed cheek mixing with tears for his dead mentor. Boss, kill him. Victor looked down at Marco's body, the man who'd saved his son's life twice, once in a storm 5 years ago, and again in this cathedral of violence. The wedding ring on the dead soldier's finger caught what remained of the colored light, a symbol of love that had endured through 3 decades of criminal loyalty. In the eye of the storm, Victor made his choice. Not between life and death. He'd faced that decision 1,000 times. But between the man he'd been and the father he wanted to become. He lowered his weapon. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying over the sudden silence. "I should have finished this 5 years ago. But not by killing her. By choosing love over fear." The cathedral fell eerily quiet, as if even God was waiting to see how this would end. Dimitri's eyes narrowed with suspicion and confusion, his fingers still poised on the trigger of a gun aimed at Victor's heart. "You think I won't pull this trigger? I think you're a dead man either way." Victor's voice was steel wrapped in silk, the tone of a king offering terms to a pretender. "But if you hurt my family, you die slow. If you walk away now, you die quick." "Your family?" Dimitri laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now, the first crack in his confidence. "Bastard children don't inherit empires. Mine does." The declaration rippled through the cathedral like thunder. Every dawn, every soldier, every family representative heard Victor Russo formally acknowledge his heir. This wasn't just about personal vengeance anymore. This was about succession, about the future of organized crime on the East Coast. Don Castillo struggled to his feet, using his bone cane for support as he surveyed the carnage with calculating eyes. The old patriarch had survived 60 years of mafia wars by reading the currents of power, and what he saw now was a seismic shift that would reshape everything. "The boy has been acknowledged," he said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and law. "He is protected by blood right." Councilwoman Delacroix emerged from her hiding place, already planning how to spin this revelation in the political arena. A legitimate heir to Victor's empire changed everything. Funding sources, protection rackets, the delicate balance of corruption that kept the city functioning. Luca chose that moment to slip from Arya's protective embrace, walking across the blood-stained floor toward his father with the fearless certainty only children possess. His small black shoes clicked against marble as he navigated around overturned pews and fallen bodies. "Daddy," he said simply, reaching up to take Victor's free hand. "You're hurt." Victor looked down, surprised to find blood on his shirt. Not his own, but Marco's, transferred when he'd instinctively shielded his son during the firefight. The crimson stains spread across expensive fabric like a badge of honor, proof that he'd finally chosen family over everything else. "I'll be okay, son." The word, son, hit everyone in the cathedral like a physical force. This wasn't just Victor claiming an heir for political purposes. This was a father acknowledging his child, accepting responsibility for a life he'd almost destroyed through his own paranoia and pride. "Your choice, Dimitri," Victor said, his son's small hand warm in his own. "War or peace? Death or life? But choose now, because my patience just ran out." The threat hung in the smoke-filled air like a promise from hell itself. Everyone in that cathedral knew Victor Russo didn't make idle threats. Dimitri's remaining soldiers looked to their boss for guidance, but found only a man suddenly uncertain of his position. Dimitri's weapon wavered as the reality of his situation became clear. He'd come to kill a bastard child and found himself facing a united mafia family defending their acknowledged heir. The political mathematics had shifted too dramatically for violence to solve. "This isn't over," Dimitri said finally, lowering his gun with visible reluctance. "Yes, it is." Victor's voice carried absolute authority, the tone of a king who just demonstrated why he ruled through more than fear. "Because if you threaten my family again, I won't just kill you. I'll erase every trace that you ever existed." The promise settled over the cathedral like a benediction of violence. Dimitri and his surviving soldiers backed toward the doors, their weapons lowered but ready. This was retreat, not surrender, but in the mafia world, sometimes retreat was enough to prevent total war. As the cathedral doors closed behind them with a final, echoing boom, Victor finally allowed himself to breathe. His son was safe. His family was alive. The war, for now, was over. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, police and ambulances drawn by reports of gunfire. Soon this sacred space would be crawling with cops who couldn't arrest what they couldn't prove, investigators who would find nothing but a funeral that had gotten slightly out of hand. "Is the bad man gone?" Luca asked, looking up at his father with complete trust, apparently untroubled by the violence he'd just witnessed. "Yes, baby. The bad man is gone." But even as he said it, Victor knew this was only the beginning. Other families would test him now, would try to use Arya and Luca against him. The price of acknowledging his son was painting targets on their backs that would never fully disappear. Arya approached them slowly, her black dress torn and stained with plaster dust from the damaged walls. For the first time in 5 years, she was looking at Victor without hatred burning in her eyes, but she wasn't looking at him with love, either. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything they'd just survived. "Yes, we do. Not here. Not now. But soon. Are you going to disappear again?" The question hung between them like a sword. Arya looked at their son, who was studying the bullet holes in the altar with the analytical eye of a future Dawn, already learning to read violence like other children read picture books. That chill I felt in that moment, have you ever felt that too? When your heart knows something before your mind catches up. Tell me in the comments if you've been there. Your story might help someone else see the signs. "I don't know," she admitted with brutal honesty. "I spent 5 years keeping him safe from your world. Now your world knows he exists. Then we make your world safe," Victor said simply, as if reshaping reality was just another business decision. "Whatever it takes." Father Romano emerged from behind his altar, clutching his prayer book with shaking hands. The priest who'd known Victor as a child now surveyed the damage to his sacred space: shattered windows, bullet-scarred walls, blood on consecrated marble. "The dead must be blessed," he said quietly, kneeling beside Marco's body. "Even in war, the dead deserve peace." Victor knelt beside the man who'd saved his son's life, the soldier who'd lied about an execution 5 years ago and paid the ultimate price for that lie tonight. Marco's wedding ring caught what remained of the stained glass light, a symbol of love that had endured through 3 decades of criminal loyalty. "He died protecting family," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "God will remember that." "Daddy," Luca said, tugging at Victor's sleeve with a persistence only children possessed. "Uncle Marco is sleeping funny." Victor looked at his son, this perfect little person who somehow understood the weight of sacrifice at 5 years old, who'd watched men die to protect him and was already processing the loyalty that death represented.
"Yeah, buddy."
"Uncle Marco he's sleeping forever now. Because he protected me? Because he protected you. That makes him a hero, right?" Victor lifted Luca into his arms, feeling the weight of his son, his heir, his redemption, his reason for everything that would come next. The child's small body was warm and solid, proof that something good had come from all the violence and betrayal. "That makes him family," Victor said. "And family protects family, no matter what." But it was Arya's whispered words that stopped his heart, that shattered his world, and rebuilt it in the same breath. "He's not the only one, Victor." Victor's blood turned to ice as the implications hit him. The cathedral seemed to spin around him, reality reshaping itself once again in ways he couldn't have anticipated. "What do you mean?" Arya pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling to a picture that would change everything. "Luca has a sister." The photo showed a little girl with Victor's piercing gray eyes and Arya's delicate features, playing on a farm somewhere far from the violence that had just erupted in God's house. She looked like Luca's mirror image, but softer somehow, untouched by the darkness that had shaped her brother's first 5 years. "Twins," Arya continued, her voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "I had twins that night, and if you want to meet your daughter." She paused, studying his face for any sign of the man she'd once loved beneath the monster he'd become. "You're going to have to prove you've changed. Because she doesn't know you exist, and I plan to keep it that way until you can promise me she'll be safe." Victor stared at the photograph, his world tilting on its axis as he processed this revelation. 2 children. 2 heirs. 2 lives that depended on his ability to be better than he'd ever been before. As sirens screamed outside, and his son slept against his chest, Victor Russo realized his greatest war wasn't with rival families or federal agents. It was with himself, and the man he'd have to become to earn the right to hold both his children. The Mafia King had found his heir. Now he had to find his soul.